Hello and welcome to the program. U.S. House Democrats are set to move forward with the impeachment inquiry into President Donald Trump. The inquiry began after revelations emerged of President Trump requesting Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky to look into former U.S. Vice President Joe Biden and his son. A whistleblower's complaint about the July phone call between the two leaders has raised questions about millions of dollars in aid to Ukraine and why it was withheld. It was eventually released in September. Joining us in the studio to discuss the Trump inquiry is Jason Smart. He has extensive experience working as a political consultant, including on the presidential campaign of US Senator Ted Cruz. According to his biography, he worked for the Digital Outreach and Data Analytics Division. Mr. Smart, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me today.
So just a little bit about your background. We spoke a little bit before the interview, and you said you have very extensive knowledge of Russian from college and from your work.
That's right. So I studied Russian throughout high school, and then my bachelor's degree relates to Russian. My master's degree and my PhD also relate to Russian. So I've studied this region extensively. Ukraine itself, I've been coming to for the last 15 years. So I do feel I know the country pretty well at this point. There's still more to learn, right. But it's I've gotten to know it pretty well.
Right, and so you write Russian language articles for one of the top Ukrainian media publications out there, Kommersant, and in one of the latest ones, in one of your latest pieces, you suggest that it's important for President Zelensky to act now and publicly announce that he's stamping out corruption, and one of his steps is to open a case, an investigation into Biden.
Well, I think to be exact, what it said and what I do believe is that Ukraine must investigate any allegations of corruption, no matter where they come from, no matter what the context, and get to the bottom of it. And I think in the case of Senator Biden, or Vice President Biden and his son, if there is, as there's much media now that has covered that in Ukraine, as well as the United States, but especially here in Ukraine, it looks bad if he says, well, we're not going to touch that issue, though. There's allegations of corruption, but we're not going to touch it because it might have some influence in the U.S. The best thing is to be transparent. And anyone that's in crisis management or communications of crisis management will say that the most important thing is transparency. We want transparency and to get to the truth. You always say that. And so it should be looked into. And, we will see what it comes to. But either way to say we're not going to touch it because the Americans this or the Americans that, it's not a correct thing. You have to show that you're serious about corruption no matter what it is or where it comes from.
But what sort of message is this going to portray back to Washington? Because speaking to a number of analysts here in Ukraine who often comment about Washington-Kiev relations, a lot of them stress that it's important that Ukraine does not get drawn into domestic U.S. politics. And this would include opening an investigation into one of the main rivals of President Trump, which is Joe Biden. Now, what sort of message is that going to send?
Well, you'll recall that Zelensky has already said twice during his marathon interview that he was going to investigate this. So this is not something that I came up with. Zelensky's already said this was his position. But I would continue that I think that it is something that the U.S. Is not really a party to. Ukraine, if there's an allegation within Ukraine, he's the president of Ukraine for Ukrainians. He must look at all forms of corruption. And because it says, oh, but the Americans don't like that, well, and the Russians don't like something else, what difference does it make? It's a sovereign country. Ukraine must look at to all forms of corruption, no matter where it comes from, and no matter whose name is associated with it, and simply get to the bottom of it. It's not saying that anyone's guilty. It's saying if there is an accusation made, it's looked into.
But wouldn't that sort of feed into the narrative of sort of suggestions of a quid pro quo between Trump and Zelensky in this phone call? This was the particular issue that was discussed, of President Zelensky openly saying that there will be an investigation launched into Biden. So how does the government avoid being drawn into U.S. politics, and at the same time, as you just mentioned, being completely transparent and open investigation into anyone, and be their number one priority being rooting out corruption?
No, I think that goes exactly to what I'm saying, though, is that the fact is that the story's not going to go away because Ukraine does not investigate it. It does not make anything better. What does in fact help is that Ukraine shows that it is completely transparent, and if there's a credible allegation of corruption made against anyone in the country, no matter if it's...
So what sort of credible allegation has been made, as far as you know?
Well, I mean, I'm sure you also read the Ukrainian press as I do. There's been plenty of allegations made. There's been plenty of documents come up. And that was within the parliament as well. The Verkhovna Rada, I think there's been 4 members of parliament who have already brought this up and said they have documents related to this. I think it's sort of unavoidable at this point. I mean, Ukraine has 2 options here. To sit there and do not do anything. And for the next year, this is going to be a story in the U.S. Regardless of what Ukraine does, this is going to be a story in the U.S. for the next year, until Election Day. And so Ukraine can either put its head in the sand and act like it's going to go away, or it says, no, we have done our part, we investigated, we found there was nothing, or we found there's something, whatever it happens to be. But to say we want to have transparency and to get to the bottom of any allegation of corruption.
I see. So you think that this is the road that Ukraine should take, continue? I know that in his marathon interview session, President Zelensky, when he was directly asked whether this is an option, he said that was an option as far as he was aware. But publicly stating that an investigation would be open would be sort of playing into that narrative. Do you see what I mean when I say in the conversation between the two leaders, that was the sort of
once
issue
again,
at hand?
I don't think he should make decisions. He's a president of a sovereign country. He must do what is necessary in Ukraine. He represents Ukrainians who voted for him. The Ukrainians who voted for him, as you know, the top political issue in the country is corruption. And to not attack corruption, to not go after it, because it looks like he's getting pressure from the Americans one way or the other, looks bad. You are the president of a sovereign country, and you have a responsibility to your voters and the citizens of this country to say, we will look into any corruption, no matter what the consequence, I will not allow corruption in Ukraine. That is the correct answer. Ukraine does not need more excuses to not look into corruption. Ukraine needs to do everything it can to fight corruption here, no matter what the consequence, because this country is being destroyed by the corruption. And it's fighting a two-front war. One in the east against the Russians, and one here in Kyiv against the corruption that is simply out of control and destroying people's lives. And they say, oh, but the Americans might not like this, or the American Democrats won't like this, and so we're not going to touch it. That's insane. No, corruption must be fought no matter what the consequence, or else Ukrainians will live worse and worse.
I see. I see your point. Let's move on a little bit. Regarding your previous work, you worked for US Senator Ted Cruz, and on your website it says that you were contracted by Cambridge Analytica. Talk to me a little bit about that. I mean, it says that you advise on how to most effectively use big data on the presidential campaign, on his presidential campaign.
That's correct.
And we know what sort of so what did that work involve?
So big data is a very complex thing. I mean, there was a team of astrophysicists we had. They're largely astrophysicists. There are other mathematical disciplines as well, but a lot of guys from Oxford, Cambridge, that sort of thing, all PhDs. And they would sit there and they would get into this very deep data and trying to figure out algorithms. And the algorithms would try to indicate within the population what shows a probability or a statistical probability that someone is likely to be a voter or not be a voter for the candidate or for another candidate, and what sort of messaging would be most persuasive for them. So for one person, it might be messaging about gun rights. For another person, it might be about women's rights. It depends on the person. But you would then target the message to them. They would receive ads in the mail, for instance, that would say, women's rights is a big issue, and here's our platform on that. Or for someone else who doesn't care about women's rights, is really interested in gun rights, his will specifically say, here's our plan on gun rights. So every citizen, you would have a message that's targeted them. You remember that 2008, Barack Obama's campaign also had an incredible big data thing, and that was actually the very foundations of big data usage in the United States. And the same data sets that Cambridge Analytica used are the same ones that Barack Obama used in 2008. It was very good, very useful.
Right, but a few years ago, following the election of U.S. President Donald Trump, a reporter for the Guardian uncovered that Cambridge Analytica misused Facebook data, and to an unprecedented scale, and had influence on the U.S. elections.
Well, as you're familiar with, I'm sure, because it was investigated, and I know for the case of the Cruz campaign for sure, we didn't actually use the Facebook data because it showed that it had no statistical value. You could add it, but it was just cloudy and murky things. It didn't actually help. No one used your Facebook data. They did experiments to see if that would show, like, if this guy has these interests on Facebook, does that better indicate which way he's going to vote? And it didn't. It's actually not very useful data. And it was never used by the Cruz campaign or the Trump campaign, as far as I remember. They had the data, but keep in mind, this is the same data set that the Democrats also had in 2016. This was not unique to Cambridge Analytica. This data set was available to multiple people. Multiple vendors also used this. Corporations, for instance. So this was not specific that Cambridge had something nefarious. This was quite common. But simply, we decided not to use it because the statistics, the mathematics, showed that it wasn't very useful data.
But Cambridge Analytica data was used also in the EU referendum.
I think you wish to say that Cambridge Analytica also worked in the EU referendum on Brexit.
I believe it's called Leave.eu.
Yes.
They worked for the company.
So the Cambridge Analytica, I believe, did have a contract with Leave.eu. I have also read that. I left Cambridge Analytica in 2015. The vote was 4 years later, 3 years later, whatever it was. But either way, they did use that corporation, Cambridge, and Cambridge Analytica helped with targeting and messaging. which is sort of what political consultancies do. So they're advising them on how to reach their constituency, what the voters might like to hear, who would be interested in a leave message.
Would you ever work with them again?
Well, they don't exist any longer. They've gone defunct. But
right, but would you work with a similar company?
Well, sure. I mean, data analytics is used everywhere, whether it's the grocery store or the drugstore or the federal government. Data analytics is a very, very large thing. I mean, that's why when you go, for instance, to the pharmacy, and they print out, especially in the United States or somewhere, they print out the receipts and the back has advertising. That advertising is specific to you. It's targeted based upon your data. And whenever you get, for instance, you go to a grocery store and you get the discount card, and everyone thinks, oh, I get a 1% discount. It's actually, the reason they gave you the discount card is to collect your data. That's why this has been going on for 20 years in the United States and Europe, is because they know that by that we can see what your tendencies are. What is it that you're likely to buy? So in the future, we know what advertisements to send you.
Right, and it's quite alarming to an extent, knowing that your data could be potentially harvested and used for various purposes.
Well, I mean, you do sign off on it when you get the discount card. There is a thing that you sign. Remember, you do have a contractual agreement with this company. But I think that it's not really scary in any way. But I don't find it to be scary. And the reason is just very simply, if you look at elections in the United States, this has been a common practice since the 1970s. I mean, in the case of the Republicans, they have I forget the name now, the database now of all the voters. The Democrats used to have Demzilla, and they changed it to something else. But in both cases, what they would do is go door to door, and they'd ask you, what are your big issues? And you would say that, my big issue is the roads, followed by schools. And so they would make a note of this. And in the election cycle, since the 70s, we're going on 40 years later, 50 years later, they have been then sending you material that was specific to that message. Or when they go door to door, they'd make sure that you would hear about the messages most interesting to you. Because it's sales. It's about what is it going to be most interesting, most persuasive to you, so we don't waste your time and we don't waste our time, and make sure that we're doing our job of persuading voters.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about what your work has been in Ukraine like. Have you been working on any sort of with any party or affiliated group?
Sure. I've worked with political parties here in Ukraine. I mean, I have a non-disclosure agreement with them, but I have worked with political parties here. But I also did a lot of anti-corruption work in Ukraine. I mean, historically, I did a lot of work. I founded an NGO here that did work. There's actually two things. One was supporting the troops in the eastern part of Ukraine to get international support also for Ukraine's efforts to fight off the Russian invasion. But secondly was to fight corruption and to create citizen organizations throughout the country that would oppose corruption at the local level. Because my theory is that if we start at the local level, it'll work up.
Right, right. And in one of your articles, you mentioned you know John Bolton personally.
Sure, I've met John.
And you know him personally. What's your explanation of when he left quickly, and what sort of impact that has had on Ukraine? Any thoughts?
I don't think it's going to have much impact on Ukraine, one or the other. I think the policy is pretty clear from both the Democrats and Republicans are pretty aligned with Ukraine at this point. I don't see that changing. So I don't think his absence or presence really will have much impact on that. Why he left, I think that it's pretty clear that he was in conflict with his boss, the president. And now it's the point of dispute whether he was asked to leave or he was forced out or he quit. But either way, he is no longer there. And it was, I think, just because they viewed the world differently. They had very different strategic views of how things should be done.
Well, thank you very much. That was very interesting.
Thank you.
That was Jason Smart, a political expert, and thank you for watching UATV. Stay tuned for more.